the Bible every day. And I remember as a youngster growing up, and then you start going to school, you read a book and then you throw it away. She reads the Bible, and I remember I was 6, she was reading the Bible, 7, she was reading, 8, she was reading it. And it dawned on me, like, what could be in this book that's so interesting that she would take years to read it. I'm thinking she was reading it from cover to cover. Apparently that wasn't the case. And while growing up, they deposited certain virtue into my life, her specifically and him to a certain degree, because even though he was an arrogant person, he was a stickler for people who has integrity. And he didn't have so many friends because the type of people that has integrity is very few. So his circle of friends were very, very, very small. And he was very unforgiving. I mean, if you crossed him one time, and that was it. Until actually he repented on his deathbed, where he had to ask everyone for forgiveness. But to go forward, as I become a young adult, and I was working at a department store in New York City called Gimbel's. They were a rival to Macy's at the time. They were about 2 blocks apart. One was on 32nd Street, Macy's is on 34th Street in Manhattan. And as a youngster, my first year in college, they hired about 26 of us, college students. And as we were studying week after week after week after week, I noticed the group was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point I was the only one left. And so when I was the only one left, I asked the manager, what happened to everybody else? And he said to me, well, they all got caught stealing. Because when we were hired as stock boarders, basically our primary responsibility was to replenish the floor as the items sell, and also to open new merchandise. And at that time, I don't know if any of you remember, Jordache jeans and Sergio Valente were in style at the time. So what they would do, they would go into the stock room thinking nobody's watching them, and they would take care of their clothes, and they would put a pair of those new jeans on and then put their clothes on top of it, not knowing security was watching. It never dawned on me to do that because that's not the way I was brought up. You understand? So later on in life, I was hired in the business that I'm in now, in real estate management. I was hired at the entry-level accounting. I was a bookkeeper. And I was working at my desk. My boss at the time, this gentleman named Mr. Jones, would come by and he would shake our hands in the morning on his way to his office. And one morning he shook my hands and then he stood there. And I kept doing what I was doing. He just stood there. So after a while I looked up. He said to me, I didn't believe people like you existed. And I'm like, what do you mean? He says, you come to work, you sit at your desk, you're not on the phone, you're not taking breaks, you go to lunch when you're supposed to go to lunch, you come back when you're supposed to go to lunch. And that impressed him a lot, to the point where later on, when he got promoted, I ended up getting promoted over at his position, actually. So I was reading the 23rd chapter of Genesis. And on the 23rd chapter of Genesis, it was a situation where Sarah had just died, and Abraham had grieved. The scripture showed his human side, even though he was a great man of faith. His wife of many decades passed away, and according to the scripture, he mourned. And the word mourn here is kind of conservative.